In the late 18th and 19th centuries, the British Empire didn't merely trade with India. It structured India's economy to feed Britain's industrial growth, and it did so through a set of policies that drained wealth out of the subcontinent, year after year, region after region, sector by sector. This is what scholars have described as the drain of wealth, and understanding it is central to the modern Indian history question, not just what Britain took, but how it systemically broke India's economic capacity. Let's begin with what the drain actually meant. When historians speak of a drain of wealth, they refer to the transfer of economic surplus, profits, revenues, interest, pensions, and remittances out of India to Britain. It was not always direct plunder. Often it happened through legal and fiscal mechanisms, taxation, trade policies, state expenditures, and the financial architecture of colonial rule. Dadabhai Naoroji gave the classical formulation in his famous work, Poverty and Unbounded British Rule in India, published in 1901, where he argued that Britain extracted an annual surplus that left India poorer. R.C. Dutt, in Economic History of India under Early British Rule, 1902, reinforced the point by showing how Britain's revenue and commercial system systematically diverted India's resources away from development. So how exactly was this done? The first mechanism was revenue extraction, especially through land systems and the growing fiscal power of the colonial state. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757 and the consolidation of British power in Bengal, the East India Company began to treat India as a source of revenue for metropolitan governance and military expansion. In Bengal, the company shifted from earlier arrangements toward directly managed revenue systems. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the company's priority was predictable revenue flow. This pressure intensified further when British wars multiplied across India and beyond, meaning costs had to be covered somewhere, and colonial policy increasingly looked to Indian taxes. But taxation alone doesn't explain the drain. The deeper problem was where the revenue went and what it replaced. Once revenue was collected, much of it financed British administrative costs, military expenditures, and civil services dominated by Europeans. At the same time, a large portion of the benefits of trade and industrial activity, especially profits, flowed to British merchants, investors, and the company's successors. In effect, India became a fiscal colony, a place where surplus was extracted to support imperial infrastructure whose purpose was not primarily Indian development, but maintaining control and feeding British economic needs. The second mechanism was the transformation of Indian trade through British industrial priorities. One of the most significant turning points was the progressive integration of Indian markets into the British industrial world. Britain's Industrial Revolution produced cheap manufactured goods, particularly textiles. As British exports flooded Indian markets, Indian artisans faced a structural disadvantage. This was not a temporary disruption. It was a systemic rerouting of demand. Traditional Indian industries, which had supplied regional and global markets, were pushed back. Their decline meant fewer local incomes, less employment, and weakened domestic capacity to accumulate capital. This process can be linked to specific imperial trade dynamics. Under company and then crown rule, policies favored British manufactured goods entering India at relatively favorable terms while restricting or discouraging Indian industrial exports. Even when India exported raw materials, cotton, jute, opium, indigo, these commodities were exported largely in raw or minimally processed form, then manufactured in Britain and sold back to India. This arrangement magnified inequality of value added. The economic surplus earned by Indian producers and cultivators often did not convert into Indian industrialization. It was converted into British profit, British shipping revenue, and British finance. The third mechanism involved finance, debt, and remittances, the financial side of the drain. Colonial India's fiscal system increasingly relied on mechanisms that transferred wealth abroad. Payments for external interest, company and later crown obligations, and payments for British personnel were all part of the outward flow. Dadabhai Naoroji emphasized that the drain was visible in the repeated outward remittances that India could not afford if it aimed for industrial growth. Later scholars and economists traced how colonial monetary and banking structures also reduced India's ability to mobilize indigenous capital for domestic development. The fourth mechanism was the political economy of land and the creation of a revenue-driven agrarian system. Under many colonial administrations, land revenue demands became increasingly rigid. When markets fluctuated, peasants bore the risk. When harvests failed, the state demanded revenue anyway. This arrangement made famines more lethal and recurring. Consider the Bengal famine of 1770, but more relevant to our understanding of structural violence are later famines in colonial India. The Great Famine of 1876–78, affecting millions across large parts of India, and the Bengal famine of 1943, though that is later and outside the main 19th century drain story. Even in the earlier period, the crucial point for UPSC is that colonial policy often prioritized revenue collection and export interests rather than local relief. In effect, the system extracted surplus and then resisted using it to protect lives and sustain productivity. How does this connect to the drain of wealth? Famines and economic shocks do not only reflect weather, they reflect policy choices. If revenue extraction continues despite crisis, and if export priorities remain fixed, then the colonial economy accelerates impoverishment. More impoverishment means a smaller tax base in the future, weaker consumption, reduced local investment, and a more fragile agrarian economy. Yet the drain persists. The surplus may shrink, but the outward flow adapts. Through new borrowing, through continued financial remittances, through trade structures that keep India exporting low-value goods. Now some might ask, did Britain not build railways and modern infrastructure? Railways were indeed built. But here, the analytical question is not whether infrastructure existed, it is who it served and how it shaped economic outcomes. Colonial railways were often designed to move raw materials from interior regions to ports for export and to support administrative control. They did connect regions, but they also reinforced the colonial economic logic, specialization in export-oriented raw materials, and the reorientation of transport investment toward extraction rather than balanced industrial development. The result was an economy that was integrated into the British world system in a way that disadvantaged Indian manufacturing. The drain, therefore, was not a single event. It was a cumulative process. Trade policies weakened Indian industry and pushed value creation to Britain. Revenue systems ensured that the colonial state captured surplus from Indian society. Finance and remittances transferred that surplus out. Administrative priorities and crisis management often maintained extraction even during hardship. Scholars like R.C. Dutt insisted that without industrial development, India remained stuck in a pattern of dependency, producing primary goods and importing manufactured goods at a disadvantage. Amartya Sen's work, though more focused on famine and capabilities, helps underline the moral and analytical core. When economic arrangements and institutions fail to protect entitlements, disasters become catastrophes. Sen's approach reminds us that poverty is not just lack of income. It is lack of capabilities shaped by political economy. Under colonial rule, the institutional configuration often made it harder for Indians to secure relief, public investment, and economic diversification. So when Naoroji wrote in 1901 about India's poverty under British rule, he was not only describing suffering, he was describing a system. When R.C. Dutt documented economic deterioration under early British rule, he was exposing structural mechanisms, not one-off mismanagement. And when we discuss the drain of wealth today for UPSC, we must explain how. Through tax extraction, trade imbalance, outward remittances, industrial decline, and institutional choices that prioritized imperial interests. And here is the closing thought. The greatest tragedy of the drain of wealth is not merely that resources left India. It is that the system trained India to be perpetually dependent, to specialize in what Britain needed, and to pay for what Britain chose to build elsewhere. If an empire can drain surplus while blocking development, then the question is not only what was extracted, but what was prevented. That is the lesson we must carry into history and into our understanding of development itself.